Hey guys, welcome back to a new week here at the Project Return Online Classroom. I am Miss Madison. Welcome. Today we're going to be doing a little intro into watercolor today and tomorrow, and actually pretty much all week we're going to be working with watercolor. Today and tomorrow we're going to be working on 18 different techniques you guys can start with just to kind of get your hands moving and just to experiment and play around with the medium. Alright, so some of the things that you're going to need, you're obviously going to need some watercolor. It doesn't matter whether or not it is in a pan or if it is in a tube. I am going to be using both in our video today. Most of you guys might have maybe one of the Crayola ones, something simple. It doesn't matter, you can use whatever is comfortable. Now another thing you're going to need are brushes. I recommend having a flathead brush. This is really good for large areas, large washes. If you want to cover the sky real quickly, this is what this brush is really good for. Also, having a round brush is good for just kind of general details, and this is a brush that I use probably the most often. Now this one, I like this one because it's a little bit more compact. I can use it for details and especially for more of a dry brush technique, which you guys will see in the video. Now obviously if you have watercolor paper, that is the most ideal, but if you have just the thickest paper that you have, I have right here a cold press. That means it has a little bit more of a tooth to it. Now you're also going to need 2 cups of water. 2 is the most ideal because you can use 1 to wash your brush off. This is kind of like our dirty water. And then we keep our other one as kind of like our clean, pure water that we use to create gradients, and that way we don't taint any of the water that we have or any of the colors that we have on our paper. Now these are some of the extra things that you might not have. If you have them around the house, that is awesome. If you don't, I will explain some alternatives that you also can use, but you are going to need some sort of tape. This is drafting tape, but you can also just use regular sort of tape that you have around the house. Ideally, don't use anything that will rip up your paper too much or something that isn't quite as abrasive, so you don't want to use packaging tape. One of the techniques we're going to use is going to have salt, so I have a little bit of salt, so if you happen to have any in your kitchen, this is something we're also going to be using. And one of the last techniques we're going to use is using masking fluid. This might not be something you guys have around the house. You can use white crayon, it creates a very similar effect, but if you happen to have it, masking fluid, a gummy eraser, and a brush you don't mind getting a little dirty. These are some other things that you're going to need. Alright, so let's jump into it. This is part 1 of the watercolor techniques. This is going to be 9, and the next video is going to have the last 9. Alright. So this first square, I'm going to be making it a solid color. We talk about the differences between what's opaque and what's transparent. This one I want to be opaque. So of course watercolors are water-based, so the more water we add, the more transparent it's going to get. The more white of that paper we're going to see coming through. Well, for this first one, I dipped into my clean water just once, but then after that, I'm really just going to keep dipping into more of my color rather than dipping into more of my water because I want it to be more opaque rather than transparent. So for number 2, we have wet on wet. Now after I clean off my brush right here, I'm going to dip into some of my clean water and I'm going to just put that anywhere on my square. Using wet on wet is a good way to create something that has a little bit more of an atmospheric feel to it. If you want to use it to create maybe a sky setting, it'd be something really cool to do that. It's a good way to mix your colors onto the paper as well. I'm going to start off with a little bit of green, but then I'm going to dip in some of my turquoise a little bit later, and you're going to see how when those colors interact on that wet on wet technique, how they start to mix together very naturally. You might not have as much control over where your paint goes, but it's still a fun way to experiment. And then taking some of that pigment from my pan, I can start to dab it into that water area that I have. I can push some of that color out towards the edges so that it starts to fan out naturally. Dipping back in to create a little bit of that darker center so it has a little bit more contrast when it starts to fade. I was careful there not to, I almost dipped into my clean water with a dirty brush, but I didn't. So for number 3, we're going to do a technique called dry on dry. This is a really good one for more detailed work. So I'm going to take more of a compacted brush and dip it in some clean water. Now for this, we are not pre-wetting our surface. That is why it's called dry on dry. The paper is still dry. Obviously I had to dip a little bit of water in to get to kind of activate some of my watercolors. But for the most part, it creates a very solid color that doesn't run as much. This is probably the most control you can have over your watercolor using this technique. You can do more detailed work, more pattern work, and you can fill in spaces with a little bit more control. Alright, so as my wet on wet was still sitting there, the water hadn't dried yet. I'm adding a little bit more water to it, and I'm going to do the same thing while adding in a little bit more turquoise. And then I'm going to push it kind of closer to the green so it starts to mix and create more of a blue-green, more of a turquoise sort of color as that green starts to mix in. So for number 4, we are going to be blending a darker value of a color into a lighter value. We're going to be using that same blue color, and I'm going to apply a thin layer using a little bit more water first of that blue to create that thin value. So now that I have that light value placed down, I'm going to dry off my brush real well, and I'm going to dip into my pigment once again, but this time with a lot less water, so it's going to be a lot darker. I'm placing it down onto my side that I want it to be darker at, and once I'm done with that, I'm going to clean my brush off. Make sure it's all cleaned off real good, because I'm going to be dipping into my clean water bowl, and I don't want to contaminate it any further. I dip into my clean water bowl. I'm going to use some of that water to blend together the areas where my darker color is hitting that lighter value to create more of a gradient and make it a little bit more gradual instead of having that harsh line from dark to light. So the next one we have is blotting. This is going to be another way you can create something that is more atmospheric, similar to wet on wet. You can create clouds, smoke, or simply if you just make a mistake and you need to pick up some watercolor because you don't like the color that you put down, you can use this to kind of like as an eraser as well. All it is after you put down a good amount of watercolor, it still should be pretty wet. Once it dries, it's a little bit harder to pick up that color once again, but you're going to take a balled up piece of paper towel and you're going to press it down onto the paper and blot away that color. So I want to use my blotting technique to create some clouds, so I'm adding in some of my blue and my green to create turquoise, very calming sort of sky effect before I take away the area that I want my clouds to be. It's important to act pretty quickly while you're doing this. I'm keeping mine fairly wet and I know that it has a little bit of time for it to dry, but pretty much once I cover this surface, I'm going to quickly blot away the area. Now keep in mind the pressure that you are applying is how much is going to be coming off of your paper. So the more you press down with this little paper here, the more I press down, the more it's going to come off, especially that bottom area right here where there's more of that liquid. Now as I go up, I want it to be a little bit less, so I'm pressing a little bit lighter I'm lifting up my hand a little bit more and I'm gently pressing down because I don't want as much to be coming off, because I kind of want it to look like the clouds are fading off a little bit more. So since we are blotting away a lot of our color, it does make it a lot lighter and more transparent. So I'm going back over it with my blue to darken up some of that value around where the clouds end. I want it to still have more of that blue hue going over it. So I'm adding all of it before I go back over and I re-blot the areas where the clouds are. So for number 6, a technique called glazing. It's going to be another way, kind of similar to number 4, how we're going to create a value gradient effect. We're going to do it by, it takes a little bit more patience, but we're going to do it by applying thin layers of paint over each other once the first layer dries. So this first layer, I'm just applying a very thin layer, and with not a lot of water. That's important, especially since we are applying it once it dries. The more wet it is, the longer you're going to be waiting in between dry times for you to add another layer. So we're going to be coming back to number 6 a few times as we move on. Alright, so number 7 here, I got my salt. This is going to create a really cool effect once we cover our area with a lot of pigment, and essentially kind of similar to blotting, where we still want it to be wet while we're working. We're going to add our pigment all over in this square. I'm going to make sure it covers it up pretty well. And I have a pretty decent amount of salt in that little bit of a little cup, but you don't need any more than just a little bit of a pinch. Now I'm going to take a little bit, and just drop it all around. Now this is another technique that we're going to have to wait for it to dry before we really see the final result, but it's going to create kind of a crackling effect in our watercolor as it dries into our water. So before I move on to number 8, I'm going to go back and I'm going to add another layer over my glazing technique. I'm doing another just light layer. I maybe added a little bit too much water, so I'm going to dry off my brush and kind of take up some of that water again so that our dry time isn't quite as long. I like to use this glazing technique, especially if I'm trying to do really harsh shadows. It's a really good way to create something that is still showing that value, but maybe in a little bit more of a harsher light rather than the more blended out technique. So for number 8, we're going to be using this technique with masking fluid. Masking fluid is a good thing to use if you want to maybe separate out certain details in a drawing that it's going to be harder to go around with our watercolor. Now I always use this brush because masking fluid can damage brushes very harshly, so it's important that we clean it directly after using it, and I really only use this brush for it. Masking fluid probably isn't something you have at home. It is something we have at the center, so if you ever want to use it, please come ask me. But you can create a very similar effect using a white crayon. So what I did is I dipped a little bit onto my brush, and I'm just going to be making these little circles. Now right now on the recording it might be very hard to see. You do have to be very careful with making sure you're keeping your details in check. It's a little easier to see when you're in person though. So while I'm waiting for the masking fluid to dry down, I did try and add another layer to my glazing technique, but I think it still was a little bit wet. So you see how it's a little bit lighter in the middle and darker on the edges? That's what happens when you don't wait for it to dry quite as long. So that's my fault. So for this gradient right here, number 9, what I did is I loaded up my flat brush with a lot of pigment. Maybe a little bit too much water than what I was going for that first layer, but I want to make sure it's a pretty solid, good amount of color first. Then I'm going to clean off my brush, dry it off, and then that's when I'm really going to come in with more of the clean water, and with one swoop from the bottom, I'm going to add a little bit of that water to lighten it and make it more transparent and lead it up towards the more opaque watercolor at the top. So when I drag my clean brush of water from the bottom to the top, all of that darker pigment pools at the top and it'll dry down into a more of a gradient effect. Alright, so next I'm going to, now that my masking fluid's all dried down, I'm going to add the watercolor over top of it. As I'm going over the circles, you can start to see them start to show because that is the masking fluid resisting the watercolor. Now what's really cool about using the masking fluid is it makes it a lot easier to add darker values around those areas that you're blocking out. So using a little bit of my blue, I'm going to go in and I'm going to darken up the areas around my circle. Imagine if you're making a sky and you want to make these stars, you want to make sure they really shine bright by building up the value behind it. Using masking fluid or even just using a white crayon, something that is going to resist that watercolor is a good way to build up those values. So we are getting towards the end. As I'm finishing up this gradient, I am kind of adding a little bit more water, blotting away some of that to kind of create a little bit more of a contrast between that darker area and my lighter area. I want to wait a little bit for the glazing to dry down. Same thing with the masking fluid and the salt. So I'm going to let it dry for a little bit and I'm going to come back and add up some more details. So now that it is all dry, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to dip in with my clean brush and my clean water, and I'm going to add a little bit more of that glazing on top of that green. Now that it is all dry, it should cover up that white patch right in the middle. And now that I'm looking at it, when I did the blotting to the clouds, it definitely dried down a lot more. So I'm going back in using a little bit more of a dry brush technique and darkening up some of those values so that it brings out the white in the clouds a little bit more. That's upping our contrast so that they stick out a little bit. There's going to be some areas where maybe I add a little bit too much of that blue, and then I'm going to go in with some water and I'm going to fray out those edges a little bit, make it spread so that maybe it doesn't come out quite as stark as I want it to. So now I'm going to knock off a little bit of my salt next. Now it's all dry. Once I knock it off, you'll notice some of the white that shows up afterwards. And that's really what the effect that we're going for by adding salt to it. It gives it this granular sand effect. Perfect if you wanted to do a watercolor beach. Now this is where that gummy eraser right here I talked about in the beginning comes in handy for removing the masking fluid. If you happen to have masking fluid but don't have a gummy eraser, you can use your hands. Just make sure they are very clean because see those little flakes? The oil from your hands can cause it to be a little dirty looking. So use a gummy eraser if you can, but you can use your hands. Just make sure they're clean. And you can see how nice and white little spots are left after using our masking fluid right there. So here are the final 9 all finished. Now we do have 9 more. Those are coming up for tomorrow. I hope you guys have fun just kind of experimenting. That's kind of the best thing about watercolor is I think it's the funnest thing to experiment with. Try different things, see what kind of looks you can get. It's very versatile, so have fun with it, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next one.